You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynn Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Monday, 2nd of June 2014. When it is a BBC journalist goose-stepping and Israel bashing go together just fine. Ed Miliband doesn't read the UK news, he gets his aides to fill him in. Essex girl who's lived in Britain for 25 years could be deported due to ludicrous rule. Illegal Jamaican criminal may be deported after serving 30 years for murder. King Juan Carlos of Spain abdicating. Le Pen as president, France thinks the unthinkable. The BBC has just learnt of illegal EU migration surge. Fellow soldiers call Bao Bergdahl a deserter, not a hero. Afghan president fumes at prisoner deal made behind his back. Thought for the day, our green and pleasant land. And finally, 2 for 1 day, Monday it is. UK news. When it is a BBC journalist goose-stepping and Israel bashing go together just fine. The thin line dividing criticism of Israel from anti-Semitism just got a little thinner. BBC journalist Chris Rogers this week was revealed to have amused himself by giving the Nazi salute and strutting about in a Hitler-style goose-step while filming a documentary on, of all things, anti-Semitic soccer fans in Eastern Europe. The Daily Mail first reported on Rogers' vile actions on their website on May the 19th. Rogers' defence was that his behaviour was intended as a joke. Humour can be very revealing. World at 8. If it was a BNP supporter doing it, the world would have blown up, the media had orgasms and the Lawrence Memorial done a jive. One law of freedom of speech and action for one and one for another. Ed Miliband doesn't read the UK news, he gets his aides to fill him in. I wish. Ed Miliband's attempts to prove he's in touch with ordinary Britons failed spectacularly yesterday when he admitted that he is more interested in American politics and baseball. The Labour leader also said he rarely reads British newspapers or watches the news and relies on his aides to tell him what's going on in the country. The revelations will add to the concern amongst Labour MPs that Mr Miliband is out of touch with voters. World at 8. That is strangely apparent as he looks like a model for Wallace and Gromit anyway. Essex girl who's lived in Britain for 25 years could be deported due to ludicrous rule. An Essex girl who's lived in England for a quarter of a century has been left stunned after hard-nosed officials warned her she could be deported. Christine North, 32, of Clacton, was born near an army base in Dortmund, Germany, but has an English father and has lived in the UK since the age of 7. The married mother of 2, described as Clacton through and through, has her own national insurance number and has voted at every election since she turned 18. But when she applied for a passport for a family holiday to France, her world was turned upside down by officials who refused the request and warned her she could be booted out of Britain. World at 8. As I said, one law for us and one law for them. A legal Jamaican criminal may be deported after serving 30 years for murder. The family of a mechanic stabbed through the heart in a brutal carjacking asked why his illegal immigrant killer was allowed to continue a life of crime and go on to commit murder. Rory Gordon, 23, knifed Harjinder Burji after he refused to hand over the keys to his Mercedes CLK during the terrifying car snatch in Ilford in September 2011. Mr Burji, 32, bled to death at the side of the road in Stoneleigh Avenue in front of a female friend, Kajal Badwa, 25, who Gordon also threatened to stab. Jamaican-born cannabis dealer Gordon is now set to be deported after being jailed for a minimum of 30 years at the Old Bailey on Wednesday. He has several previous convictions, including for robbery, dating from when he was a teenager, raising questions about why he was not deported sooner. World at 8. Why should he serve those years here? Send him back to Jamaica. European news. King Juan Carlos of Spain abdicating. King Juan Carlos of Spain is abdicating, Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy has announced. Juan Carlos, who is 76, has ruled since 1975, taking over after the death of dictator Francisco Franco. The king's son, Crown Prince Felipe 45, will take over the throne. For much of his reign, Juan Carlos was seen as one of the world's most popular monarchs, but recently many Spaniards have lost confidence in him. His reputation has been tarnished by a long-running corruption investigation into his daughter and her husband. Support for the king fell further when it was discovered he had been on a lavish elephant hunting trip to Botswana in April 2012 in the middle of Spain's financial crisis. The king gave a rare interview in January 2013 on the eve of his 75th birthday. His Majesty King Juan Carlos has just informed me of his desire to renounce the throne and begin the process of succession, Mr Rajoy said in a short statement. He gave no reason for the decision, saying the monarch himself would explain, but Juan Carlos's health is failing and he has had a number of hip operations in recent years. World at 8. I remember him as the golden boy when Franco was in power and the jubilation of the Spanish when Franco died and he took over. I always thought Franco was brilliant. And Spain has certainly gone downhill since he died, in every way. Le Pen as president, France thinks the unthinkable. The victory of France's far-right National Front in EU elections and the disarray of its two main parties has the French asking themselves an awkward question. Could its leader, Marine Le Pen, be their next president? The answer for now is probably not. But the mere fact that serious analysts are even entertaining the prospect of Le Pen entering the Élysée Palace after 2017 elections shows how much the political landscape has been shaken in the past week. The anti-immigrant Eurosceptic Party notched up the first nationwide poll victory in its 4-decade history in a European Parliament election marked by voter disenchantment with Europe and the entire French political establishment. 2 days later, France's body politic took another blow as the leadership of the Conservative opposition, UMP, quit en masse after allegations of fraudulent funding of ex-President Nicolas Sarkozy's failed 2012 election campaign. A new jobless high released on Wednesday underlined why Socialist President François Hollande's unpopularity ratings remain stuck at record lows for a modern-day French leader. It added to the sense of deep desperation felt by many French. The way things are now, when Marine Le Pen speaks, people listen to her, said Jean-Daniel Levy of pollster Harris Interactive. Election after election, she just goes from strength to strength. World at 8. Well, although Le Pen's message is hardly different from Nick Griffin's, the French are far more patriotic than the Brits, as were the Germans before the Third Reich. The BBC has just learnt of a legal EU migration surge. In their own words, there has been a significant rise in the number of migrants reaching Europe in recent months, the BBC has learnt. The number of people attempting the dangerous sea crossing from North Africa to Italy has risen sharply, says Frontex, the EU border agency. From January to April, 42,000 migrants were detected on these routes, with 25,650 of those crossing from Libya. Combined with 7 other less busy routes, the total figure for this year is probably now about 60,000. World at 8. You can probably double that for true figures, and what a surprise. Figures up. Well, we didn't expect that, did we? World news. Fellow soldiers call Bowe Bergdahl a deserter, not a hero. The sense of pride expressed by officials of the Obama administration at the release of Army Sergeant Bowe Bergdahl is not shared by many of those who served with him. Veterans and soldiers who call him a deserter, whose selfish act ended up costing the lives of better men. I was pissed off then, and I'm even more so now with everything going on, said former Sergeant Matt Verkant, a member of Bergdahl's platoon, when he went missing on June 30th, 2009. Bowe Bergdahl deserted during a time of war and his fellow Americans lost their lives searching for him. Verkant said Bergdahl needs not only to acknowledge his actions publicly but face a military trial for desertion under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. A reporter asked Defence Secretary Chuck Hagel Sunday whether Bergdahl had left his post without permission or deserted, and if so whether he would be punished. Hagel did not answer directly. Our first priority is assuring his well-being and health and getting him reunited with his family, he said. Other circumstances that may develop and questions, those will be dealt with later. Afghan president fumes at prisoner deal made behind his back. The Afghan president is angry at being kept in the dark over a deal to free 5 Taliban leaders in exchange for a captured US soldier, and accuses Washington of failing to back a peace plan for the war-torn country, a senior source said on Monday. The 5 prisoners were flown to Qatar on Sunday as part of a secret agreement to release Army Sergeant Bao Bergdahl, who left Afghanistan for Germany on the same day. The only known US prisoner of war in Afghanistan, Bergdahl had been held captive for 5 years. The president is now even more distrustful of US intentions in the country, said the source at President Hamid Karzai's palace in Kabul, who declined to be identified. He is now asking how come the prisoner exchange worked out so well when the Afghan peace process failed to make any significant progress. Karzai's press office said in a statement that the US deal to transfer 5 Taliban militants from a Guantanamo Bay jail to Qatar violated international law. No government can transfer citizens of a country to a third country as prisoners, said the statement, issued on behalf of the Foreign Ministry. Thought for the day: our green and pleasant land. Well, is it our green and pleasant land anymore? Many, even pro-multiracial idealists, can see that our green and pleasant land is being mind-stripped to provide heating and more, or to build more of everything, to bring more people into this country who will require more and more of everything, and coming from where most of these past, present and future migrants come from, they will not care a jot for the country or its people when our establishment have run themselves and this land ragged to do just that. I still maintain, even despite the often appalling weather, that what my father said to my mother is true. He said you couldn't beat a fine summer's day in this country anywhere, and he was right. I love England. The same cannot be said for much of its population and all of its establishments. The country has not made the man, so to speak, nor vice versa. In fact, one of the cleverest and most long-lasting propagandas has been that England only exists to take in and care, which means pay for, millions of so-called economic migrants who in reality don't care where they go as long as they get money for landing on those shores. It is this unpatriotic inrush of all migrants that has brought Britain to its knees, both emotionally, politically and financially. And the worst thing of all is that we are still buying into this flim-flam, and the only people to benefit are migrants, local bent councillors, greedy and bent builders and landowners who have fallen on hard times. Headings of time bomb as 1 million extra homes needed in the south, and the laughable and almost deadly effect of the Help to Buy, which is like manna from heaven for born in Britain foreigners, and in no way, shape or form actually helps the young English couples it was surely meant to help in the first place. In fact, it is taxpayers' money that has helped fund at least £15.5 million worth of loans on 31 properties worth between £500,000 and £600,000, which is hardly the one up, one down type of first-time buyers, is it? However, in the next line they're saying that the figures of 85% are first-time buyers with properties around the £150,000 mark. And this, of course, demolishes the first paragraphs as lies when, frankly, it isn't. The media are frantically digging to print both the truth, heavily disguised, and the lies also. So if a sheeple, you cannot really get the true facts at all. The true facts are that every time an affordable site is built, the local council get more money from the government, whichever government that is, to make a high proportion available, not to whites on the local council lists, but to immigrants, who are classed by the most local councils as needy, whereas many of our Indigenous couples are living in albeit grotty conditions already. Thus they are already domiciled. Scarcely, by the time foundations are laid, many have been brought up by immigrant groups, families, clans or businesses, and when completed let out to other members of that particular racial group or religion, thus immediately doubling the number of migrant families in that small enclave from the beginning. You will no doubt notice that most, if not all, new migrants sport nice new cars as well. Not for them public transport on a rainy day. That's kept for our elderly. The sad fact is that despite all this, the South is full up. It was full up 20 years ago, before the onrush of the EU and France pushing its sub-Saharan Africans and North Africans into our country, and the huge clans of Nepalese which are still pouring in en masse into the southeast regions, Hampshire especially. All have to be housed, but why, I ask myself? Why do we, on this small island, already groaning under the weight of the lost north with Islam and other Asians doing a balancing act on the old northern houses and streets, still take on more? Are our governments stupid or afraid of being called racist? Arabs, Africans, Asians and Eastern Europeans are still travelling unstopped and unchecked into this country every day, every hour and every minute, adding to your taxpayer bills, benefits, our international health service and transforming, or being allowed to transform, our education systems beyond recognition from just a few years ago. And the voter thinks that we're all too far right in the BNP while exhorting liabilities like UKIP to utter our very words which were trumped out ad nauseum pre-EU elections. Are we all mad, bad or just plain stupid? There is a housing shortage, but no amount of help to buy will solve it because many of our houses are being bought up or rented by foreigners. I don't frankly care if they're from outer Mongolia or Poland. They still ain't English and they are living on English soil, doing English jobs, sending their kids to English schools and universities, making money either out of us lazy Brits and taking massive benefits and working for and pushing the NHS in certain areas to within an inch of its life. It ain't the elderly causing these problems. It is almost 99% the foreigners, both old, new and born here. Now of course ITV will do a programme on how immigrants benefit our society, with a small exception of the Eastern Europeans, who are taking the brunt of the anti-migrant socialist brigade, which is entirely acceptable, as Farage says it is. We have whole roads and estates in the southeast and southwest occupied by foreigners, and still more are buying up more. Our benefit system, which nearly every ethnic migrant cashes in on, makes it easy for migrants to buy, rent or sell British properties. We don't have the normal laws that the countries most of these people come from have towards European buyers. That is, nil immigration and nil property owning or business owning rights at all. No, not us, and the result is what we have. A dwindling pot of houses which, if we had not had immigration for the last 50 years, would have been occupied by our young, and we wouldn't need thousands of more homes, as apparently our birth rate is low and our nuisance of the elderly will obviously die off in years to come. So why, without massive immigration, would we need more housing? Well, of course we wouldn't. Immigration feeds the housing market on all levels, from rich to benefit receivers. And the funny thing is the amount of agents who buy up semi-detached or small detached in a street and then proceed to flout the building regs, only these people can do it and get away with it, and build or add on huge edifices that drive their British neighbours mad or away, and then their clans move in and buy up next door. High Wycombe especially is full of such places, as is London. The South East didn't have the rows of practically condemned properties some northern towns did, which also served a purpose. Kent is one of the worst for Romas and Asians, Hants, Somalis, Kenyans and Nepalese, Surrey, Indians and Asians, Buckinghamshire, Asian Muslims, Oxfordshire, Asians and of course a plethora of Chinese and Filipinos everywhere. My point being, why are they allowed in or here? We have no obligation to take everyone in and pay for them, build for them and practically lie down for them. I think even the Brits can see what 50 years of immigration has done to England and the English. We don't need to do anything more again. We need to wake up. Our government are about to spend almost £100 million on a very nasty and intrusive project called the HS2, which will cut the time of the journey from London to Birmingham by 20 minutes only. This, of course, if ever completed, will not give the Brits jobs. It will, however, very nicely fund more migrants into this country in a shorter time up to Birmingham, which we have already lost ethnically, give drug runners, arms runners and people runners a much easier and happier journey, and also do the double whammy of ruining a large portion of the loveliest landscapes and property in the United Kingdom. A real winner for diversity in the old world order. Now, because I no longer sit in a very large house with land in prime countryside, I can still sympathise with the people who have worked hard all their lives and find their way of life and just about everything else under the hammer, so to speak. I do not have Boris the Lawrence's attitude of simply coming on down and taking the money. This venture, which no doubt is benefiting a huge amount of behind the backroom boys and foreign investors, is the zip which will open up the UK to more and more intrusive and ugly futuristic buildings, airports, roads and indeed more HS2s, which decimate the usually white upper class middle areas which need to be protected, not thrown to the winds. These areas are England. They are what the word English means to a world which doesn't want to destroy it. You can just imagine the outlet for those areas which will be dedicated to the land of the immigrant of the future. All these properties will drop in value to be snapped up by foreigners who will build and build and build until there's no green stuff left. More roads will be built to accommodate the supermarkets and crap which will inevitably follow. After this monstrosity is finished, if ever, those landscapes will reflect a very different country, and it will be our fault for not doing something about it. You can't rely on any mainstream political party to do anything about that, because they are all in the pockets of the financiers and the magic words of jobs for the UK, which are regularly meted out and which we all know means more Eastern European workers and builders as in the Olympics disaster, not jobs for us Brits. Just the ruination of a country for what? That money could solve our national debt problem. But then the establishment would not have a rod to beat us over the head with, would they? France and Germany have high-speed trains, but then they had a form of those before the last war, and their countries are larger with more spaces to build, and they are also wealthier. Britain is a small, overcrowded island which the powers that be seem hell-bent on making more overcrowded and more multiracial at great cost to us Brits. Where is Al-Qaeda when you really need it, or the IRA? Naughty, naughty, but am I? Not really. At least I'm not a rat leaving a sinking ship, but fighting to stay on board my green and pleasant land. And finally, 2 for 1 day Monday it is. If security isn't that tight, there'll be hackers in every website. Though with all that resetting and password forgetting, we can't get in try as we might. And this one is for the man in my life and male nationalists everywhere. I have a little sat-nav, it sits there in my car. A sat-nav is a driver's friend, it tells you where you are. I have a little sat-nav, I've had it all my life. It's better than the normal ones. My sat-nav is my wife. It gives me full instructions, especially how to drive. It's 60 miles an hour, it says, you're doing 65. It tells me when to stop and start and when to use the brake, and tells me that it's never, ever safe to overtake. It tells me when a light is red and when it goes to green. It seems to know instinctively just when to intervene. It lists the vehicles just in front and all those to the rear, and taking this into account it specifies my gear. I'm sure no other driver has so helpful a device, for when we leave and lock the car it still gives its advice. It fills me up with counselling, each journey is pretty fraught, so why don't I exchange it and get a quieter sort? Ah well, you see, it cleans the house, makes sure I'm properly fed, it washes all my shirts and things and keeps me warm in bed. Despite all these advantages and my tendency to scoff, I only wish that now and then I could turn the bugger off. You've been listening to The World at 8. I am Lynn Mozart and I wish you all a very good night.
You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynn Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Monday, 2nd of June 2014. When it is a BBC journalist goose-stepping and Israel bashing go together just fine. Ed Miliband doesn't read the UK news, he gets his aides to fill him in. Essex girl who's lived in Britain for 25 years could be deported due to ludicrous rule. Illegal Jamaican criminal maybe to fill him in. I wish. Ed Miliband's attempts to prove he's in touch with ordinary Britons failed spectacularly yesterday when he admitted that he is more interested in American politics and baseball. The Labour leader also said he rarely reads British newspapers or watches the news and relies on his aides to tell him what's going on in the country. The revelations will add to the concern amongst Labour MPs that Mr Miliband is out of touch with voters. World at 8. That is strangely apparent as he looks like a model for Wallace and Gromit anyway. Essex girl who's lived in Britain for 25 years could be deported due to ludicrous rule. An Essex girl who's lived in England for a quarter of a century has been left stunned after hard-nosed officials warned her. BBC journalist Chris Rogers this week was revealed to have amused himself by giving the Nazi salute and strutting about in a Hitler-style goose step while filming a documentary on, of all things, anti-Semitic soccer fans in Eastern Europe. The Daily Mail first reported on Rogers' vile actions on their website on May the 19th. Rogers' defence was that his behaviour was intended as a joke. Humour can be very revealing. World at 8. If it was a BNP supporter doing it, the world would have blown up, the media had orgasms and the Lawrence Memorial done a jive. One law of freedom of speech and action for one and one for another. Ed Miliband doesn't read the UK news, he gets his aides deported after serving 30 years for murder. King Juan Carlos of Spain abdicating. Le Pen as president, France thinks the unthinkable. The BBC has just learnt of a legal EU migration surge. Fellow soldiers call Bao Bergdahl a deserter, not a hero. Afghan president fumes at prisoner deal made behind his back. Thought for the day, our green and pleasant land. And finally, 2 for 1 day, Monday it is. UK news. When it is a BBC journalist, goose-stepping and Israel bashing go together just fine. The thin line dividing criticism of Israel from anti-Semitism just got a little thinner. She could be deported. Christine North, 32, of Clacton, was born near an army base in Dortmund, Germany, but has an English father and has lived in the UK since the age of 7. The married mother of 2, described as Clacton through and through, has her own national insurance number and has voted at every election since she turned 18. But when she applied for a passport for a family holiday to France, her world was turned upside down by officials who refused the request and warned her she could be booted out of Britain. World at 8. As I said, one law for us and one law for them. A legal Jamaican criminal may be deported after serving 30 years for murder. The family of a mechanic stabbed through the heart in a brutal carjacking asked why his illegal